Hello, I'm Li Hao. So we have seen how we're able to style our elements in Svelte using the style attributes, class attributes. We've talked about how we can use the class directive that you can toggle on and off, apply certain class to your elements. And today we're going to explore another features from Svelte that allows us to pass custom properties from CSS Custom Properties to your component. And we're going to explore how that help us to style our components, control certain styles within our component. Well, this is actually a new feature added in Svelte in version 3.38 based on this RFC. As you can see on the screen, RFC PR13 says passing CSS custom properties to components. And it says that there's a lot of text that you can take a read about this. I'll link this in the description. Explain the motivations and things like that, but we're not going to read all this out for you. Rather, we're going to explore how this will help us in controlling some parts of your components stylings from the outside. This feature will give us one more tool in our toolchain to help us style our components. So let's take a look at an example that I prepared over here. So here I have a button component. I create 3 buttons on the screen with the red button, the blue, and the yellow. And as you can see, how I control the style of the components is by using the props. So I'm going to pass in a props called ButtonColor, and sometimes I pass a props called TextColor that control the color of the text. Because if you take a look at the codes in this button component, you will see that actually allows 2 props, a button and a text, and there's some default color. So the default will be the red color and default color for the text will be white. And as I can see, we're gonna use these 2 value in our style attribute. So the background is using the button color and the color is using the text color. So all good. Yeah. I would say that this is one of a good pattern for you to allow styling your components, right? But sometimes you might think that sometimes for some reasons you don't want to use props to control the style of your components, because sometimes you think that props should be more of data kind of thing, more for JavaScript side. If you want styling, maybe you want to do it on the CSS side, right? So here we have here I would like to propose an alternative to what you can do over here. I wouldn't say this is better or worse. It's just an alternative, one more tool in your toolbox that you can use and employ. So here, sometimes you want to style your elements using a CSS Custom Properties. So CSS Custom Properties are custom properties that is that are not that are not defined, that you can customly define. So properties are background and color. They are built-in properties, right? But then you also can define some custom properties. For example, the way you do it is that you come over here and you add 2 dashes and you name your custom properties over here. So here I can say maybe a custom property called ButtonColor, and then I pass in a value. So maybe I can pass in value like red, and to use this custom property, I will come over here and say var ButtonColor instead. Right, so now you can see all my buttons are in red color. So this is the custom property, right? You can define it anywhere, any element, and it will follow inheritance based on the DOM tree structure, right? So if your parents define this custom property, all the elements, DOM elements based on the DOM structure of the tree element tree will receive these custom properties and can able to use this custom property. Right, so here we are defining and using it on the same elements. So you can come over here and have a span instead, and come over here and use this value if you want to. So say style background equals to, yeah, over here. And it does not have to be use it in an inline style. You can also have things like maybe a style tag and say define like a span element with background equals to var background color, right? So you can define this custom property over here called button color, and all its elements and its element children will be able to use this custom property. So depends on what the value is, you will use that value over here. And you can use this value across a lot of places, right? It doesn't have to be just in span, background color. It can, if you have another, say a div over here, say some text, you can also use it multiple places, right? So it's just all the elements that is underneath, or all the elements that is within this scope of your custom property will be able to use this the value of this custom property over here. So as you can see, you can have the text and some text in different color, and yeah, using background and color different properties can use the same custom properties over here. So what this means is that because you can use this element, this custom property, once you apply to one element, all its children will receive it, right? So meaning it doesn't have to be come over here. It doesn't have to be within this button component. You can have this written somewhere else, somewhere higher, as long as it's parent of the of your elements in the element tree structure, in your DOM tree structure, right? So if I say I wrap this button with this, if I wrap the button with a div, and I come over here and define the style, say button color as red, you can see that now this button will receive this button color red, because this tool now does not have any color applied because the button color is undefined. And if you have undefined, then the background and color will be undefined. So you can so in CSS, if you want to use a custom property, and sometimes you know that maybe this may be undefined, you want to provide a fallback. So the way of providing fallback for a custom property will be come over here in your var, you say your custom property name and then a fallback value. So here I'm going to fall back to say blue. And here I'm going to fall back to say blue as well. And now as you can see, oh sorry, yeah, it's not working because I shouldn't have the quotes. And now you can see that now instead of red, you will fall back to blue. And if I come over here and wrap this button, and I say style equals to button color yellow, you'll see that now this will be in yellow color, right? And so this is all CSS, right? It has nothing to do with Svelte. And one more thing I want to point out is this itself can be there is like hierarchy, there is like some sort of like inheritance in terms of the element tree of your custom property, right? If when you are reading a custom property, you read from the nearest parent that is defining this custom property. Meaning if you come over here and define another div that has a style called button color green, you see that the yellow still applies. This is the same as how you add CSS property in your style sheet, in your elements, right? When you change the color to green and you change the color in this div to be yellow, then all the text will be in color yellow because the nearest parent rule applies, right? And it will overrides whatever is set out there. Right, so if I remove this, you'll see that now it's in yellow in green color because now the nearest one will be this one that's been defined. Right, so CSS custom property is very similar as a normal property in CSS. except it's custom. You can define any name you want, and you start it with 2 dashes, and you can use it in anywhere you want, like a variable in CSS where you use var and then this custom property name, and then if you want, optionally, you can have a fallback value. Right, so all of this is about CSS. Got nothing to do with components, but now we're gonna tie it back a bit on how we can use it in our components, how we can use this to style a component. So here, instead of providing props, if we now have another way that we can, instead of providing props, now we have another way that we can allow people to affect the colors or the styles of our elements, right? Here instead of providing props, we say if we define in our docs somewhere, like in our component API, say that okay, we are going to use this property called ButtonColor to style our button. Then from outside here, we know that okay, we just need to provide this style like color green. Then you affect a color yellow over here. Then you affect the color inside, right? This is somewhat like a props, but it works in a element DOM element structure way, and it works using CSS. It got nothing to do with the Svelte at all. But here, once you define like okay, I would accept CSS variable like color and CSS maybe property called text. Right, let me go back to here and say, let me revert some of our changes. I'm gonna say background color, it's gonna be var button color, and then fall back to red, and color will be using var text color, and fall back to white. Okay, I forgot I shouldn't use quotes because quote does not work in CSS. Okay. If I do this, I can also remove all these things. All right, let me revert all the changes I've made so far. Now we don't have to take in any props, and we can allow people to come over here and style this. Right, I can say text color is black, and now you can see I am styling this yellow button to be yellow color and black, and this button to be a div style button color blue and text color yellow, right? So some people will prefer using CSS to style, like everything relates to style, use CSS. Some people may have that preference, and this is one of the way that you can use, right? This is purely CSS. Got nothing to do with Svelte at all. It's just about you can pass CSS Custom Properties from the outside, and then you can affect styles inside of your component. One good thing about using this method is that you don't have to come over here and reach into elements inside the components. So meaning you don't have to know, like for example, previously if you don't have CSS Custom Properties to change the style inside using CSS, and you don't have any props to change that, the one way that you can do is to use the style to try to change it, right? Where you would write div, and then maybe somehow that within a component there's a button, so you look for the button element and you want to change something inside there, right? Maybe font size 20 pixels. And because the button itself is not written, like in this element itself, there's no div button. And because this button is written inside the components, usually we'll write it with a global so that we can target buttons that is not within this component file, but is within some components that we are using. So we're targeting the div that is scoped to these components, all the div, and if they have a button inside, those buttons should be font size of 20 pixel. Right, so this somehow is a bit leaky in a sense where you kind of have to know what elements is rendered inside your components. Of course, you can document that. You can publicly say, okay, I will have a button's element, and you can style it, right? It's up to you. But sometimes you don't want to expose that. Sometimes, sometimes you're using a button element. Sometimes for some logic, you're using a span or some other elements, and you don't want to expose that as a public API for other people to know. So in that sense, you wouldn't want to do this. So here is an alternative where you can use CSS is that, okay, how about I don't tell you what kind of elements there will be, but I tell you like what kind of CSS custom properties I'll be using. For example, in this case, button color and text color, and just style them, right? You don't know how I would use them because I may have multiple elements that use the same custom properties or use a few custom properties. Say I can use this button color as a background. I can use it in my box shadow and all these things. I've just let you know. You don't have to like find a way to override them. I just let you know I'm going to use this custom property, and you can just change it to change the style of my component, right? In that way, you use a CSS custom property to override them over here. So there you go, how to use custom properties to do this. But sometimes you don't want to add an extra div, and there is for good reasons you don't want to add an extra div, because if I revert all this, you may notice something happens when I add an extra div. You notice, okay, not just the color have changed. You notice that this button and all this button itself is an inline element, display inline block. You notice that now these two buttons are side by side. But once you add a div like this, kind of create a new for a block formatting context, which makes this div renders in a new line, right? So you add styles over here, and you say button color yellow and text color black, creates a new line, right? So I think I need 2 dashes over here. Creates a new line, and sometimes we don't want that, right? So if you know, okay, this is creating a new line, maybe we can use a span, because span is inline itself. But that means we kind of have to know like what kind of elements inside, and kind of have to decide whether we are going to use a div or a span, or maybe within this component is actually rendering 2 buttons, and it itself may have some sort of if the parent container is using some display flex or something, you may adding an extra element over here may spoil that will break your layout, right? For example, maybe you're using a grid, right? A grid is a good example, because using a grid, each element in a grid level decides which where do you place that grid element, right? So for example, I come over here and say div. Over here with a div, we're gonna use display grid, grid template columns. I'm just gonna 1FR grid template rows. Okay, I don't even need this, right? You notice that now I have 2 by however many rows of a grid. Okay, maybe I just do put 3, right? If I don't have this div, all the wrapping div, you'll notice that buttons are rendered in a 3 by 2 matrix. But once you wrap with a span over here, this whole thing is considered as 1, right? This whole span is considered as 1. Now these 2 buttons are rendered within a one grid cell, right? Which is not great, which is not what we want. We just want to have a way to add like a style custom elements on over here, and it now breaks our layout. It doesn't matter whether we are using div or span, right? It's just because previously there's 2 elements, now it becomes only 1 element. So the way to solve this, again, we're going to reach out to CSS. A way to solve this is to use a custom display value, which is called display contents. What this display contents means is that treat this div itself as nothing, as nothing at all in terms of layout, right? So what this means is that just don't consider me at all when you're doing layout. Just consider all my contents, right? If my contents has 2 elements, it should consider as 2 elements, and you place these 2 elements separately in your grid or whatever layout you're using. Just consider me as nothing. Consider me as gone. I'm not here at all in terms of layout. So which means this element itself cannot be applied, cannot have like padding, cannot have margin, cannot have anything, right? It's just gone in terms of CSS layout. So here we kind of solve this with display contents, and now again we can add CSS custom properties to this button, right? Of course, this is a very contrived example because sometimes you don't have all these different buttons that you want to have different styles. Maybe in your case, all your buttons you want is yellow and black text button, right? Then maybe you don't even need to wrap div at this level. You just need to wrap it over here. You just need to add this custom properties over here, right? Just need to add over here, and all the buttons are yellow color and black, right? Then you don't even need to worry about display contents at all because yeah, it does not matter at all, right? So the case that I show you just now is when you want to style a particular button component over here. You want to wrap around a particular components because it wants to have stylings, custom properties defined on that is specific to this button itself, right? So let me revert some of the things. Let me copy back this, and I just want to say that it's different because this is green and white. Okay, you can see now again it's not occupying 2 cells separate independently. Now we use display contents, and now you see there are individual cells. So we have talked we spent the whole video talking about how we CSS custom properties, how we can use them, what kind of situation that you may occur, how you can work around and fix it, how you can use display contents and things like that. So where does our passing CSS custom properties to components come into play? Well, we are actually staring at it pretty close right now. So here we say that we come into some sort of conclusion when you have certain scenarios where you want to wrap a component with a div just because you want to style it, and you want to have this div to have display contents because you don't want to affect the layouts, because maybe this button itself, the parent of it, has some sort of display grid or display flex. You don't want to break it, and you want to have a div elements that you define some CSS custom properties so that you can affect this button only and not its neighbor and stuff like that, right? So Svelte actually provides a sugar syntax. So to have a shortcut syntax to write all this, to write this div that has display contents as custom properties applied to it, right? So it's a shortcut. It's a sugar syntax. What it means is that we write some nicely written syntax, but under the hood it's going to translate into what it is, which is what we're going to see over here, right? What it's going to translate is you have a div and display contents and all this thing over here. So let's see how the sugar syntax looks like. So here, instead of writing this, we can have, okay, I think these 2 props are useless, so we can remove. And just to compare, I have my original code over here, and I'm going to show you how it will turn out to be over here, right? So the sugar syntax is that you can have a props that starts with double dashes, and you can name with you can have a property value like this, right? And now you can remove this div. And both of these looks the same. If you inspect element, you'll notice that this and this is actually the same, exactly the same. It's just that it allows us to write this way. It looks like slicker. You don't have to you don't have to write display contents. You don't have to write extra divs. Your code looks shorter and nicer, sweeter because of the sugar. But under the hood, it's actually doing this, right? This this just translates to this, and then you and then you get Svelte to render whatever to control this div, right? And also what this means is that we've seen previously where we can have dynamic styling from on the div, where you can have, say, color over here, a property called color. Let's let color equals to green. You can have that over here as well, color. And then this variable itself can be dynamic. So if I have an input, type color, bind value equals to color. You can see over here, if I come over here and choose pink, you can see all these button colors change. So this is dynamic. Right, so here you go, passing CSS custom properties to components. So one caveat over this is that this custom property, this custom props that you pass in as a custom property for your component has to be written this way. You can't use a spread props, meaning you can't actually spread it if you have an object that have this kind of property. Right, this does not works because it's a limitation of this this custom properties for your components right now. Because in compile time, we actually have to know what this what are the whether you have custom properties defined on this CSS custom property defined on this component itself. If you do this and you have like some sort of variable that you can spread over, in compile time, there's no way to know whether you have custom properties using, right? With custom properties, then you will wrap the component with a div. Without, then you don't even need this div at all because pointless, right? So you need to know whether you need to create this extra div compile time. That's why itself cannot be spreaded across. This custom props cannot be spreaded. So I hope that explains why and the limitations of what you can do. And of course, you don't always have to reach out for this. As I explained earlier, you can also define custom properties over here if you want to. When you want to wrap across all the components you want, then you don't have to actually reach out to this. This will be even better. But instead of having like wrapping all the button components with extra div elements, right? So if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, clarify, comments down below. And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next one is out. So see ya. Bye bye.